Welcome to the third lecture of the Science and Society series organized by Paraspar of Office of Communication, Indian Institute of Science. Today we have Professor Indira Chaudhary, who will speak on the predicaments of the institution and legacy. To give you a brief introduction of the speaker today, Professor Indira Chaudhary is a scholar in residence at the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore, where she started the Center for Public History. She has a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, formerly a professor of English at the Jadavpur University, Kolkata. Dr. Chaudhary's academic interests have included history, women's studies, science history, cultural studies, translation, and lexicography. She compiled the Indian English supplement included in the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary in 1996. Her book, The Frail Hero and Virile History, was awarded the Tagore's Prize in 2001. Among the other archives, Dr. Chaudhary has set up the archives of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, during 2002-2006. She has been an archival consultant to IIT Kanpur and has been conducting oral history interviews since 2002. She has curated several archival exhibitions at TIFR, including Partners in Science, JRD Tata and TIFR in 2005, and Homi Bhabha, the Cambridge Connection in 2007. So this is a short introduction of the illustrious career of Professor Chaudhary. And over to you, Professor Chaudhary.
Thank you, Vitasta. That was a very generous introduction. And I realized that I've done very diverse things. So for this audience, I think I'll just recount that I set up the archives of Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and I wrote a book, in fact, two, one about Homi Bhabha and another one about of TIFR. And what I'm going to say today is based on the experience of setting up the archives, as well as, what I've written in these two books. I think one of the things, and I'll now begin to share my screen. Just give me a second. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is visible. Yeah.
But yeah. So I think what I'm basically I want to talk about is when is founded by somebody who's a revered scientist, what is the nature of the legacy of that institution? What kind of science goes on there? What happens there? That is what I was curious about as I started doing institutional history, looking at archival material and trying to understand this question. Now, I want to briefly, very quickly go back to, oops, I'm sorry, got out of full screen. Just excuse me.
It's showing full screen to us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm getting a little window where, your little window is coming on top of the screen, so I'm not able to.
We can see your slides actually in full screen.
No, I can't read from the slide.
Oh, okay. Now sharing has stopped. Yeah.
Yeah, I stopped sharing. I'll just share again and see. Yeah, so I think I want to go back to, the colonial period a bit to recount why the particular kind of institution Bhabha was trying to build was unique and why, we should try to remember what was happening in India prior to 1947. That is during the colonial period. And I think if you look at the kind of studies that have gone on, you'll find that, colonial science was primarily, as Deepak Kumar tells us, primarily science applied to production of systematic knowledge about the colony. That is its flora, fauna, minerals, and topography, and the solution of certain practical problems of the day. Certain material benefits did accrue, and some development did take place. But here the key question arises, whose development and for whom? So obviously this was for the benefit of the colonizer, and you really did not see uh, anyone who did serious science did it with their own resources, often supported by Indian institutions that were, that C.V. Raman won the Nobel Prize. Oops.
Yes, it's
And
shared.
I think, this is the point of this was that it was very, very difficult for people to do fundamental research. There were very few who attempted it, and those were not encouraged. So if I move down, and I think this is something that Bhabha talks about quite early. When he's back and he's talking to people he studied with in Cambridge, you find that he's talking about how it's so necessary to improve the quality of research and the standard of teaching. And he talks about the Indian Institute of Science. I thought this particular quotation would be interesting for all of you because this is directly about the direction of Professor J.C. Ghosh. And, he says how in 48, he says it has expanded enormously and a large number of new departments have started. But I and other members of the council feel that the level of work leaves much to be desired. And there is too much tendency to concentrate on teaching and not enough research. In order that the quality of research should be sufficiently high, it is necessary that at least the top people in each department should be really outstanding so that they can put to the people below them fruitful problems and coordinate the work of their department. Many members of the council have a feeling that the heads of many of the departments are not of the requisite standing and that the director has concentrated too much on increasing the quantity rather than improving quality. And this is written to Frederick James, who's coming to India at that point to, assess the kind of work that goes on at IISc. Bhabha, of course, founded TIFR in 1945. He was part of the council, as you can see, and he had moved out to Bombay. But I think what is happening here is interesting because this is insider knowledge that Bhabha is sharing with Sir Frederick. And what is also interesting, he has a little, PS in this letter where he says, confidentially, I must add that there's the usual wrangle between the Bengalis and the Madrasis, which takes a particularly acute form between Raman and Saha in their respective schools. And he adds that, there was a meeting recently where both Raman and Saha called each other liars. And on that occasion, says Bhabha, both speaking the truth. So, there is this kind of talk as well. So if there's a concern about the quality of science done. And this is a concern that I think when I did these oral histories with scientists, most of whom joined the TIFR, but were not people who had obviously come from TIFR, they too spoke about the general quality of scientific research that they had been part of in their training. That so when we come to PK Maitra, with whom I had done this interview, I asked him about his PhD project. And he says, of course, I remember it, but it is not worth telling anybody anything about. It is not one of those projects. It is called biosynthesis of vitamin. So it is of no consequence. I think when you give a problem to a student, you should give him a problem that in his own little mind, he should be able to see the problem developing. Close-ended problem I was given. So I think it only says that the school I came from was not a good school. I feel very sorry to say this, that it didn't help us to do science. So I think that was not right. In other words, I think most of them felt very frustrated about the way in which, they were asked to do science. It was very mechanical. There was no creativity. And I think, this was the case in most scientific institutions. And I think when Bhabha speaks at what becomes later INSA and is NISI in 1963, what he says is that the scientific institution, whether it's a laboratory or an academy, has to be grown with great tree. Its growth in terms of quality and achievement can only be accelerated to a very limited extent. This is a field in which a large number of mediocre or second-rate workers cannot make up for a few outstanding ones. And a few outstanding ones always take at least 10 to 15 years to grow. So in other words, using this very, very organic metaphor, I think what he was trying to get at is that to grow science in India, you have to give it time, but you also have to prioritize quality over quantity. So I want to now go back to, with this background, I want to go back to Bhabha's own, scientific background and do a little bit of a historical recapitulation of Bhabha's time, not only at Cambridge, but IISc. So he actually left for Cambridge around the time he was 17 and a half. And there is this self-portrait he painted, and he had won the Bombay Art Society medal for this. So I just wanted to flag that, he's also an artist at a very young age, and he leaves for Cambridge in 1926. And the other is a photograph from Cambridge in 1928. And it is at Cambridge, where he had gone to study engineering, that he really discovers that he prefers to do physics, rather than engineering. And he says, and he discovers this love for, physics, and also his love for art. And of course, he says that, someone who has to pursue either of these professions has to give up all thoughts of wife or home, country or race, and do whatever he may, not for any small part of the race, but for man. I'm driven to pursue science and art at all costs. Science shall be my wife, he says, and art my mistress. And this is, when you think of this, he is all of 21 at this point. And, this is a very tall claim to make. But it'll take him some years before he can persuade his father to let him study physics, to do, in addition to engineering, another tripos in physics. And, of course, because he also wants to do art, at that time he does a number of these paintings. This is a painting that is right now at the Cavendish Laboratory, Cambridge. And this is a portrait of Sir Lawrence Bragg. And it's interestingly painted on brown paper. I have no reason why. At Cambridge also, his physics is certainly something that gets early recognition, because you see here that, the Kapitsa Club that was founded by the Russian physicist Fyodor Kapitsa in 1922, it was very prestigious to be invited to speak at this club. And Bhabha spoke there on 1st February 1938 on the heavy electron. And this is actually an archival page from the Kapitsa Club records. Now, this is 38. The following year, when Bhabha comes back to India for a holiday, the war begins. And as war begins, he's unable to go back and join his position in the Cavendish at Cambridge. So what happens is that he stays on and becomes, he's got a little unit, the cosmic ray unit, which is actually, interestingly, most of you from IISc will recognize this veranda. It is in one corner of this building that Bhabha sets up his cosmic ray unit. And you see him here, and you also see Vikram Sarabhai standing right behind Bhabha, and C.V. Raman, of course, who was then the director, along with um, Professor Millikan from Caltech. And Millikan had visited in 1940, after which I think Bhabha and Sarabhai tried to replicate some of the experiments that Millikan had done. And you find that this photograph is iconic in some sense, because you see a lot of the scientists at that point who are there, and you find that this is the period when Bhabha is working at IISc. And what, of course, it's still known as Tata Institute. It was, I think when I want to get off at the bus stop or ask a rickshaw to drop me, I have to say Tata Institute rather than IISc. So this is where he worked. And at this point, he's come back in 39. He is there till 1945. But till 1940, Bhabha is, a reader there. He does become a professor because there was a rule that you could not have two professors in a department. So there was already C.V. Raman, who was the professor. So Bhabha, of course, the exception is made and he becomes a professor later, but he joins as a reader. Now, there's something that happens that changes the way he begins to look at what can be done for science in India. And that has to really to do with certain honors that come his way while he is at IISc. Because prior to this, prior to 1942, he is writing to Millikan, writing to various people in the US to say that, let me join you in your work, let me join your laboratory. I don't have anybody really to speak science with here. And that is a bit strange also because, it is Raman's IISc. He is, he has colleagues he publishes with, but I think he misses the atmosphere that he had in Cambridge. Now, what happens is that though this photograph is 54, this is 1942. This is a letter from Dirac written in 1942. And you'll notice that there is a little stamp on the cover of the letter which says past. And I often ask students, what is this past about? Of course, you have to remember there's a war going on, and past basically means it has passed the censor. So it is Dirac asking him to apply for the Adams Prize, and this is Bhabha's theory of elementary physical particles and the interactions, which he submits for the Adams Prize in Cambridge. And when he gets it in 42, around the same time, through Raman's recommendation, he also becomes a fellow of the Royal Society. And he is, of course, a very young fellow of the Royal Society. Now, this, I think, in my interpretation, changes the way he starts seeing what he could possibly do, because now suddenly he is at the center and there's a lot more, resting on his shoulders, a lot more responsibility. People are looking up to him in some ways. And there is this kind of possibility, of course, because India is going to become independent soon. So when I look at the beginnings of TIFR, Bhabha actually writes to Saklatwala, Sir Surab Saklatwala, who heads the Dorabji Tata Trust, asking for a grant so he can begin this Institute of Physics. And it is actually almost a private-public partnership between the Tatas and the government. At that point, it is the government of Bombay, and it is inaugurated in 45. It actually begins in IISc and moves to Bombay uh, later in the year. And I will play a little bit. TIFR actually has a number of audio recordings, and I'll play this, which I like to play only because we seem to have forgotten one of our key scientists, and that is Sir Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar. And this is his voice where he's talking about Bhabha and the kind of research into nuclear physics.
A year ago, Dr. Bhabha and I were working on the plan for the development of a fundamental research laboratory for nuclear physics. The problem which perplexed us was whether we could afford to have a separate institute for nuclear studies.
Now, those of you who follow the history of science in this way, you'll find Jahnavi Phalke has talked at length about the role Bhatnagar plays in taking away resources from IISc. I'm not going to go into that because, IISc could actually well have done nuclear physics, but the resources are not made available at that point, and Jahnavi actually, in a very nuanced way, tells us that history. Bhabha begins his institute, the top left-hand photograph, in his aunt's house in Pedder Road, in the building that was called Kenilworth. And then when it grows, it moves to the Old Yacht Club. And what you see, Bhatnagar reading his speech, you see that in a temporary shamiana in the present site of TIFR, which was given, in Kolaba reclamation, and the foundation stone was laid only in 1954. And this is Bhabha at the inauguration of the new buildings in 1962. Again, I'll play a very short excerpt.
While I was working as a professor at the Indian Science in Bangalore, I noticed there was no institute in India devoted solely to fundamental research.
So this was, again, a theme that, we have come across earlier, that there's no institute devoted to fundamental research, and now we must begin it, and that's how he gets support from the Tatas. Now, one aside I want to say is that when you notice the building, you notice that this kind of building is very modern and it is very new for that period in India. And this style is a certain kind of international style. And Bhabha gets, Helmut Barsch, who's an architect from Chicago, to design this building. And, there is a certain investment in modernity at that point that you begin to notice. And I think he's very aware of that, but he's also conscious that, there is a certain pioneering involved. And this pioneering had to do with, extruding aluminium to make these glass panels. It was done for the first time by Godrej and Boyce. And it was very interesting that he brought all this together. And I think, this and citing, I'm just going to, and citing, Le Corbusier, saying that, there is a certain kind of uh, architecture Corbusier stands for. And this is, I think, important for Bhabha, that the institute has to be a certain kind of space. And we'll come back to that later. For him, architecture and the kind of paintings that were there in the institution, all this was part of a larger design for living. And I think he did this because he actually believed that he had to create an institution that was similar to what he had seen in Cambridge and Princeton. And you'll see, if you go into the institute even today, you'll see that, it's preserved some of these older ways. And you have, of course, the amoeba garden, which he had designed, uh, aerial view from the 4th floor. He also starts collecting art quite early. He had been given permission by Nehru to spend 1% of his budget on art. And what is interesting is that, this is discussed in Parliament and it's not seen as, useful. But at the same time, if you look at the prices at which he's buying this art collection actually now is in a public space. It is not put away in some private collection. There was also something else, and I think, like Swaroop puts it, that, there was this idea that you have to build your. Was he thinking of the institution as, I'm sorry. Can you still see my screen? Yeah. So not only was he thinking of the institution in terms of its aesthetics, but also the scientific research. Yeah.
The sharing has stopped.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll come back to the sharing then. I don't know why that happened. It suddenly.
We can see now.
It seems I have a bad network, so.
Okay.
So there was an emphasis on building for science, and I find what is interesting here is the way they devised a method by which you could teach students to do research, because students had to take a massive leap coming from the universities, which were not really alerting them to the latest research. So I have here, that is a photograph of P.C. Vaidya, who's better known for the Vaidya matrix, about which he had written before he came to TIFR, while he was at BHU. And what he says at that point is not only was there accelerated learning from resources that were there were books, papers, preprints. People attended lectures because Bhabha insisted that, he will invite international scientists to come and speak at his institute. There would be discussions with scientists, and the students had to present regularly at colloquia. There was also a lot of peer learning. There was a Saturday club, and, take lecture notes of visiting scientists, and these were Nobel laureates sometimes. So, how does a master student do that? You have to really pull yourself up to that level. And this is again from another, interview I did with B.M. Udgaonkar. You can see him here at the back. And he goes on to talk about, the books he read, and, how he also read some things in German, and how students had to keep a logbook about what they were doing or reading or working on. And from time to time, Dr. Bhabha would read those logbooks and ask them about what they've done. And sometimes, he'd suggest a problem, and they had. And same was true of mathematics. because in mathematics, there was K. Chandrasekharan, who was designing a very similar kind of course. And there were courses by K.G. Ramanathan and K.C. or K. Chandrasekharan. And of course, look at the people who'd come there, Warren Ambrose, Eilenberg, Lawrence Schwartz, all of them would come and lecture there. And they had to be prepared for that. And these would, enable them to find the problem that they wanted to work on. And there were, of course, inputs from the courses, and you had to absorb the course and in the correct way and think of their own problem. And obviously, that's why most of these mathematicians became very well-known mathematicians quite early. Now, I mentioned earlier that, inviting international scientists was a part of, the pedagogy that he designed. But I think there was something else, and something that was quite interesting, where Bhabha went out of his way to invite scientists who were, in some kind of political situation in their country which didn't give them freedom. And the first letter we have is written to SS 1948, where he says, Kosambi and I have read with concern of the spread of war in China and the approach of the fighting to the region the institute is located. And of course, he then tells Chern that, it would be good if you want to come here as a visiting professor, tell us who your collaborators are, they could come with you, and you could, stay here in our institution for some years, if you like, and do your work. And this is also something he offers to Bernard Peters, because Bernard Peters had found it increasingly difficult to function in the USA during the McCarthy era, where Oppenheimer had actually named him as a dangerous man and quite red. Now, he is, he comes to TIFR, I think, before 1954. He comes in 52. And then in 54, the press wakes up, and I have this little, press clipping which says Tata Institute expert red. And this is in the archives because J.R.D. Tata is very concerned about this. And there's a letter then that is also in the archives where Bhabha says, but Bernard Peters, who's setting up the experimental program, is an excellent physicist. And he is not a member of the Communist Party, though he was anti-Nazi. He did have left-wing sympathies. But I don't see why, we should be too concerned about this. And, it is very interesting because Peters stays in India for a good 8 years and returns again from Denmark, because he had gone off to Denmark from India. Now, again, another form of institution building was to, have this kind of scientific international colloquium. So what you see here is a mathematical colloquium, the function theory colloquium in 1960. The institute is still at the old yacht club. This is, of course, a tea party during the colloquium. And here is IISc again, the first summer school organized by TIFR with Murray Gell-Mann and Dalits was held in 1961 in Bangalore. And you'll see not only Bhabha, but Professor M.G.K. Menon, but you also see Alladi. You see Professor Alladi here because he was, coming from Chennai. He was beginning his institution at that point. And of course, Obed Siddiqui, the founder of NCBS, begins, winter school in molecular biology in TIFR some years after he joins TIFR. So there is this way of teaching students so that they are directly linked to, international research. There also is this hiring of scientists who have worked worked with scientists abroad. So MGK Menon, who used to work with Powell, is hired in 1955, I think. And I think, that background that he had, this is an interesting conversation where Bhabha tells him that though I could appoint you as a professor, but in the interest of the institute, I would not do that. So it's better that you begin at the bottom of the scale as a reader. And of course, he says he doesn't feel very disappointed because he just wanted a salary that would enable him to live in India. And his salary was 650 rupees, which was actually not bad for that period. And but the problem was that there was no housing in Bombay, and that's why that became a real issue for many of them. Now, I think the point I'm trying to make is that TIFR had this international network with which it connected, and always brought people back to India and gave them a place. So I'm not talking about the obvious examples like Siddiqui and Govind Swarup yet. Now, if I make a jump there and talk about Bhabha's legacy, I think the nature of institutional legacy is such that quite often when there is an institution that is founded by a very eminent scientist, the legacy is often viewed as his legacy, the scientific legacy of Bhabha. But I think it was more his institutional legacy that was important. So if we try to answer the question, who got Bhabha's office? Of course, the office of the director was occupied, was the position of the director was occupied by Professor Menon, followed by Professor Srikantan. But when I asked Srikantan where he sat, uh, of course, it's a different story. So, but let me first say that, why this gets seen as Bhabha's legacy is because the institutions tend to talk about the legacy in terms of the heroic individual scientist. And this is J.R.D. Tata talking about Bhabha.
Bhabha was, to me, one of the three most remarkable men I had the privilege of knowing in my life. One was Chaudhary, one was Chaudhary, and the third was Bhabha. And when one tries to think of the future and how history will be regarded by future generations, I think that it would be right that it should be felt that Homi Bhabha was certainly one of the three greatest Indians that have lived in the past in this century.
So this gets repeated again and again. And I think the fact that Bhabha died tragically in an air crash in 1966, that you have this larger than life Bhabha being created in the institution. So here are some pictures of the crash. And here is a ceremony that was held at the steps of the library, which is a Parsi ceremony, the Uthamna ceremony that is done on the 8th day. And it is interesting that you see people outside watching the ceremony taking place. And it is felt by Professor Choksi, who incidentally, the same person after whom your Choksi Hall is named, but Professor Choksi, who was Baba's friend, but also part of the council at that point, felt that it's appropriate to have this ceremony, as he says, in this temple he built for other worship. And there is this religious ceremony happening in the scientific institution. It is not talked about by the scientists. They only seem to remember the kind of condolence meeting they had and how they went back to work right afterwards. But I think what happens is they remember it when they are shown the photographs. That's because, you know, this is not something that you expect in a scientific institution. And I think it was interesting that when asked why they had this, this in the institution, they said because they felt, even his mother felt, that this would be the right place since he had given so much of his life and energy to this institution. And that's why, but it was a very big shock for everyone. And so you see people like Professor Srikantan saying that, you know, uh, Professor Menon could not reconcile himself to sitting in the same room, in spite of J.R.D. Tata insisting that he occupy the same room. He continued like this 9 years, right from 66 to 75. I did not want to violate that either. But the room was open for council meetings, and I made it available for all other meetings. However, J.J. Bhabha and J.R.D. Tata would always tell me at all council meetings that I should shift my office there. So this I found remarkable, that nobody occupied that office until much, much later. The office was, these are photographs I took in 2008. And this was an office that was a replica office with the real furniture, and that was in TIFR foyer when I went to set up the archives. And I think in 1997, which is, almost 31 years after Bhabha dies, S.S. Jha actually puts in the effort and moves into that office that Homi Bhabha had occupied. Because he says, he calls it the Homi Bhabha room, and he says we just have to start taking charge of that room and we cannot not occupy it. And I think, the council also thought, including Bhabha's brother, thought it was a good idea. But, I have always wondered about this sort of, is that the legacy of Bhabha, that people couldn't match up to him and couldn't occupy his office? But actually, I think that is only a minor question in the whole thing, because the entire institution building effort is the legacy that lives on. And I think, if you look at how institutions talk about their past and make up their narratives, you'll find that they don't mechanically reproduce the past. They work the past. They represent it every time in new but related ways for particular purpose in particular form, and use the past to create a particular desired present and future. So what I see TIFR doing is that there's a proliferation of institutions, and institutions that somewhere echo, not always in architecture, but in maybe functioning, some of that original idea that Bhabha had about institution building. And I feel that is, the predicament of legacy, that it is not an individual legacy so much as the institutional legacy. And I'll stop with that, with thanks to the archives of TIFR, the New India Foundation, and numerous other individuals who helped me along the way. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Chaudhary. I have heard you so many times, and every time there's something new, I always hear from you. And thank you for sharing those amazing, rich archival material. Now we'll take some questions. May I request whoever has a question to raise your hand or to type in your question in the chat box. Yes, Chinar Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. That was a really interesting presentation. I was wondering, because you said institutional legacy, what was probably the effect of the establishment of TIFR to, say, institutions of fundamental research or generally scientific research across the country, across the rest of the country?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question because it lets me bring in something that I wanted to, and then it's looked like a very long presentation and I couldn't. See, what happened to TIFR was actually quite, I'd say, quite tragic because it became, for a long time, it remained an island, almost an ivory laboratory in India, where it did not interact much with, other scientific institutions. So, uh, and when I've interviewed people like Professor Mukunda, who was part of theoretical physics there, he said he felt that he was not a part of the larger scientific community in the country. And the occasions, TIFR actually, he felt that there were very few occasions and he felt very cut off from the rest of the country, and he leaves to come into IISc. So I think that interaction improved only in the last, I think, 20 years or so, 20, 25 years. But in the beginning, I think what they had built had become just too exclusive. And, I think that's why I say that, it was a bit of a tragedy, but that it didn't reach out. Now, it tried other things. For example, Siddiqui would have organized the Mahabaleshwar courses, where other, college teachers would come in and interact and learn. Or there'd always be these courses that were organized by people in TIFR, and there would be that kind of interaction. But collaborative work they did not do until much more recently. So I think, that was, and that's what people like Professor Mukunda were telling me, that, they felt very isolated, that why should they feel cut off when, they are doing science and the others are also doing science. So I think in 72, Mukunda moves to IISc because IISc was much more open, much more, it much more connected to the rest of India. TIFR had connections to the university because it wasn't a deemed university until recently. So it had to give its degrees through Bombay University. It did help Bombay University set up its mathematics department, for example. A number of the TIFR scientists, or someone, let's say, like Anil Sadgopal, left biology and went off to Hoshangabad to do his, school science project. So there was, a lot of that kind of work, a lot of outreach, but it didn't do scientific collaboration at that level that it does now.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that.
There's another question by our colleague, Dr. Narmada Khare. Did Bhava try to build TIFR in some way that was intentionally different from IISc?
Yes, I think so. I think his model was elsewhere, and I've talked about this at length in other talks or even in my book. That I think I wrote a paper called "Science Happens Elsewhere" because at that point he was just looking at models that were in the UK, in Europe, and in USA. He was not looking at IISc's model. And I think one of the things that he wanted to avoid, and that's that first quotation that I took from his letter to Frederick James, that, you know, we shouldn't fill up positions with uh, just by quantity. You know, just because there's a position, we shouldn't fill it up. In fact, one of his last speeches, which he makes, I think, about 2 weeks before he passes away, he talks about how important it was for his institution to actually hire people only when he found somebody who was suitable. For example, in 45 itself, A.V. Hill, no, in 44, A.V. Hill, who was visiting India, had told him to begin biology in TIFR. And TIFR does not begin biology for a long time. It is only in 1961 or 62 actually that Obed Siddiqui comes. I mean, Obed Siddiqui writes to Bhabha and, you know, advised by Leo Szilard. And that's when Bhabha says, okay, I think this young man will be able to set up biology. So he has that kind of thinking about, you know, how he'll do this. He had far more flexibility. He didn't have that kind of government structure. And he actually wanted to create a science institution which was not bureaucratic. And unfortunately, it ends up becoming very bureaucratic. I mean, there are notes where he writes about how, though he says, I have respect for the IAS, the ICS, but they were dealing with law. They were dealing with administration, not with science. So we don't need so many administrators in TIFR. Let us keep it far, you know, neater. But that doesn't happen. And towards the end of his life, he says his major challenge has been scientific administration.
There's another question by Professor Anand Suresh. Can you please elaborate on residual effects of colonialism within nationalism and internationalism in the context of TIFR and Bhava?
Oh, thank you. That's a very interesting question. See, I think, you know, I was actually revisiting some of the interviews I've done, not only with people at TIFR, but other scientists. And it was, you know, I was always struck by the fact that the way scientists dress, you know, in the early, uh, you know, years for their conferences, they are all suited booted. They are all very westernized, except for Yashpal, who right from the beginning wears, you know, his trademark kurta and pajama. Now, this was a symbol, I think, of how they felt about this whole enterprise. And I think in TIFR especially, there is a sense of nationalism, but I don't know whether that nationalism is also a strategy at that point to make it, you know, something that can show or demonstrate TIFR's importance to the nation. But of course, there is this one incident which, you know, P.C. Vaidya had recounted to me, who was there in 47 when, you know, on the day of independence. And it's quite vivid. It was quite vivid in his mind. He said, you know, Baba came that day, and P.C. Vaidya was part of the nationalist movement. And he said, I had put up the flag. I knew that, you know, we have to put up the flag. I had put it up, it was flying there. And Baba came and said, where is the flag? He said, oh, it's already up. He says, no, 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 we can't do it that way. We must raise it with great ceremony and sing the national anthem, because today is the first day that we are putting up our national flag. So Vaidya said, you know, for the first time it struck me that he was a citizen like all of us, and he was taking pride in it. But I don't think you really, see the kind of nationalism that you find, let's say, in Saha. There is a strategic nationalism, as I keep saying. And when it comes to this internationalism, that is also, that network seems very, very important to doing fundamental research at that point. And, so a lot of the early scientists are, after some years, sent off to do their PhDs in Rochester, for example, or in Caltech. Jha himself works in Caltech. I must apologize for the noise. There is, some work going on at home which we couldn't postpone. So there is, that kind of internationalism. But other scientists I've interviewed, and TIFR scientists too, they saw this network not just as an opportunity, but as people they could compete with. That they are also feeling that, this is our arena where we'll compete, and we have to do work that is equal to theirs. So I think it is a very um, ambiguous relationship, if you like. It's not directly, there's no high nationalism there. There's no charged nationalism there. Thank you for asking that.
There's another question, I think, related to your previous response. Is getting into foreign university easier than getting into IISc?
In the present, I don't know. If you're asking me about the present, I really don't know. I feel, though, that, now students are much more focused. I mean, they know how to write a research proposal, or, what areas they'd work on, what they would choose. Whereas earlier, there were very few places. For example, when I was interviewing C.S. Sheshadri and M.S. Narasimhan, the two mathematicians who we know so much about now, Narasimhan told me this interesting thing, and he's coming to TIFR in the 50s. And Father Racine, who was a mathematician who was in Loyola College, Madras, now Chennai, told them, if you want to do mathematical research, go to TIFR or give up mathematics. You have no choice. There's nowhere else you can do mathematical research here. So at that point, that is the kind of reputation TIFR enjoyed in mathematics, and maybe in some areas of physics.
A question from our colleague Deepika. Thank you for a fascinating talk. As someone setting up an institutional archive, how did you work around attempts to retell, re-narrativize the institute's past?
That's an interesting question, because, I was fascinated by the archives. I mean, I would spend hours. I'd go back in after dinner because I lived on campus, and keep looking at those letters. And I think I still know that archive very, very well. Quite early on, Vrinda Pathare, who was working with me and today heads the Godrej archive, we had decided that we want to bring out the stuff and show TIFR its own history, so to speak. So once a month, we would create this board where we would do these color xeroxes of original documents and photographs and create a story. Now, those stories would be quite fascinating, because some of them were very contentious, but people would read them. And let's say there was one about the Bhabha Saha correspondence and how contentious that was. And there was one which was about Ramanand Bhabha. There were, of course, things about TIFR's art collection. And the narratives would keep changing as we found those. There was no ready-made narrative because the institute told one kind of story, but we'd find things and, put them together. And that was a very nice exercise because I think students got very interested and we would have a quiz. We'd post a quiz question which they had to answer and find out and come to the archive. And I remember the most moving moment was we had got some gardening files and we had put up a whole board on how the garden came to be designed. And TIFR actually pioneered tree transplantation, big trees being transplanted from one area of Bombay to another. And we had put up the names of all the gardeners who were involved in that transplantation. And one gardener, I think, came to me later. He said, "Will you give me a copy of that document?" And I said, "Of course, but why do you want it?" He said, "See, my father was involved in that transplantation. I just want to keep that." And I thought, I felt very happy that we were doing this from the archive because it seemed to tell the story of the institution at different levels. And people could get, different stories. So, we do the canteen. So the canteen staff would feel quite. So we'd not only do stories about science, but all the other things that went into the making of that institution. And I think I quite enjoyed that process of looking through, the archives and seeing all these amazing letters because people wrote letters and they took time to write those letters. And so I think, these were very, very different narratives. Sometimes people would come and argue and say, we don't think that you should actually say this publicly, etc. But, it was up there for 2 weeks and then it came down and then we wrote it again. And all of these are now made into PDFs and put up in a website, I think. I mean, I don't think they put it up anymore, but I think we really enjoyed it when we did. We also would conduct a quiz, an annual day from the archive. And we got the institution interested in the archive. And I felt as an archivist, you need the buy-in from the institution. They need to, start seeing that what you're doing is important and they are engaging with it. And that's how the archive came to us, I think also because Professor Kurup, who's no more, he one day came and said, I see that you keep looking for things and you keep going into various old filing cabinets. I want to clear my loft. Can you take charge of it? And I said, yes, of course. And then he asked me, why are you seem very happy with me? I said, yes, I would be. You gave me files that one had Einstein's letter, another had some Raman's letters. So I think, that those files were put away when Bhava died and not revisited. So we got this intact 2000 files, 2000 odd files. And those became the core of the archive, actually. So yeah, so you can actually show the institution that there are many paths it has, and there are many narratives that are there.
Is there any other question? This is by Rennie Thomas. Do we have archival sources to look at the life of technicians and mechanics who were very much part of the institution building? What are the possibilities of thinking and writing about the histories of Indian scientific institutions beyond scientists and founders? Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you for that question. Yes, we actually documented the glass blowing section before they shut down. We were very popular with the workshop for two reasons. One, we took their files, we, had stuff about them. In fact, my book has quite a bit about the workshop, which was so important. But I think there was another reason why the workshop liked us so much. That's because we had a poky little room, which was our archive. We had no budget for new furniture. We used to go into the workshop and look at some of the old furniture that was thrown away by some scientist or some lab. And this was good wooden furniture. So, the carpenters were thrilled that they were again, polishing it up or resizing it a bit for our little office. And so we had a very good relationship with them. And sometimes they would find things, some old equipment or something, and they'd come and tell us. So one of the things I think it is very possible to write the history, because you see, we interviewed a couple of glassblowers who told us about the legendary H.K.L. Murthy, who was this glassblower who really did magical things, but he was also someone who would hold his own with the scientists and tell them, "Don't watch over me. What you want, I will make you. Don't come and stand here." And he was so hot-tempered that they would just go away. But he's in fact the one who helped make the famous Siddiqui's equipment, which, he did some of his famous experiments with about smell. So I think the maze. So I think, that the glassblowing section was very important. And when they talked about, how they became irrelevant, there was a story of science and technology there, because they were telling us, when Corning comes, this is what happens. We no longer make equipment. We are not asked to make equipment anymore. So it was, really interesting how they spoke about their craft and what happens to them afterwards. And of course, as I showed you, the antenna was made in the workshop itself, and they're very, very proud of showing us that and telling us what are the things that they did. So yeah, I think one should write these stories, these histories. And I think when I look at revisit my book, which was on TIFR, it includes a number of these oral histories, and even the book we did on Bhabha, Ananya Dasgupta and I did on Bhabha, includes people from the workshop and the glassblowers, because he was in conversation with them too. So we kept all of them.
Are there any more questions? Okay, then shall we wrap up for today? Okay. So thank you, Professor Indira Chaudhary. That was a fascinating lecture, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. The visuals, everything, your narration. Thank you so much, and we hope to have you again sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.